Since the mind has no existence apart from this spurious entity, or ego, it follows that all the creations of the mind, including ignorance and bondage, and the consequent conditioned existence consisting of enjoyment and suffering, which we call life, are outgrowths of the ego and partake of its unreality. That ignorance is unreal, which will be seen later on. That this teaching is correct will be clear to us if we look at the facts without bias. The most careful analysis of the whole of our past experience, we can find no proof of an individual soul other than the ego. The ego itself is just the primary ignorance, the recognition of which is the starting point of our inquiry or investigation. It is here shown that it is an imaginary entity, a pseudo-entity, being a compound of two uncompoundable elements. Thus the whole of this conditioned existence, which we call life, is founded on this lie, that of the individual soul. It is natural, therefore, that life should be full of lies, and therefore full of disappointments. This teaching may be difficult to grasp, but it is the fundamental truth as taught by the ancient lore. There can be no correct understanding of the ancient lore if this teaching be not accepted. So long as the notion of individuality is retained, all philosophical inquiries are bound to prove useless, for they cannot lead us out of the primary ignorance. This was clearly taught by the sage Sankara when he said, "Only so long as there is an identification effected by the mind of the real self with the intellect, is there an appearance of individuality and of conditioned existence for that self. But in reality, there is no such being as an individual soul, other than the spurious entity imagined by the intellect. In the study of Vedanta, we do not find support for the existence of any conscious entity having an existence of its own apart from the Supreme Being, Atman, who is ever free and all-knowing. The sacred texts say, "There is no seer, hearer, thinker, or knower apart from this being, or Atman. There is none but he that sees, hears, thinks, or knows. Tat tvam asi is what that called that thou art, or thou art that. I am the reality." These and hundreds of other texts are our authorities. The ego is the only source of all our life experiences. They are what they are because of the ego. We say, "I am so-and-so, I am a doer of actions, I am happy, I am miserable," and so on. In every single thought we can find this "I am." It is in fact the common factor of all thoughts without exception. No thought can arise which does not contain this "I am." But this "I am" is not a property of the mind. So we learn from the sage and from the Upanishadic lore. We are told that this "I am" is the light of the real self. That self, or Atman, being infinite and unqualified, this "I am" is not really the little thing we take it to be. And we take it to be limited, imperfect, and bound to the wheel of pleasure and pain only because we do not discriminate and distinguish the element of reality in the ego from that which is false. Hence it ought to be clear to us that what obscures the real self is simply the acceptance of this ego at its face value, plain as our true self, which it is not, as shown here. This was exactly the essence of the teaching of the sage known as Gautama Buddha. He was once asked by someone about the immortality of the soul, and Buddha replied, "That soul about whose survival you are anxious does not exist even now. It is unreal." What he meant was that the questioner was assuming the existence of an individual soul, which does not really exist, and hence the question was based on a falsehood. Buddha did not mean to deny the existence of the real self. The questioner misunderstood the answer. He thought that the sage Buddha had told him that there is no self, no Atman at all. He ought to have asked a further question, such as, is there a real self? And if there be one, what is its real nature? He did not do so, but went away, and Buddha discovered that he had unsettled the man's faith without enlightening him. The fact is worthy of note that when questions are based on a false assumption, it is not possible to answer them by a simple yes or no, for either answer would be wrong. The individual soul being unreal, it follows that there is no perceiver of the world. This may be surprising, but it need not be so. The seer and his spectacle are inseparable. They are like the two ends of a single stick. As a stick will always have two ends, so every perception involves the two, the seer and his spectacle. The three, namely the seer, the spectacle, and the relation of seeing, form a triad, of which the essential element is the seeing, which becomes possible by the light of consciousness, which is the true self, Atman. By that light, both the seer and the seen are manifested. It is not possible to attribute reality to the seer while denying it to the spectacle. If we accept the view that the spectacle, namely the world, is unreal in any sense, then we must also accept the view that the seer of the world is unreal in the same sense and to the same extent. The spectator is in fact an integral part of the world. Both in waking and in dream, the spectator and the spectacle form one single whole, appearing and vanishing together. The sage brings home to us the spurious nature of the ego, the individual soul, by means of a parable. On the occasion of a marriage, an uninvited guest, an utter stranger to both parties, came in pretending to be an intimate friend of the bridegroom. At first the hosts, namely the bride's party, believed him and honored him accordingly. But after a time suspicions arose and inquiries began to be made as to who he was and what right he had to come in. The two parties met and began to question each other. The impostor saw that he was sure to be exposed and treated as he deserved if he remained, so he quietly disappeared. Just like the impostor in this parable is this movement called ego. It is neither the real self nor the body. So long as no inquiry is made, this egoic movement persists and enjoys the status of the real self. But when an inquiry is made, when the quest of the real self has begun and persisted in, it will vanish, leaving no trace. This is exactly what we are told by the sage in his following words. This ego, which is but a ghost without a form of its own, comes into being by taking hold of a form, keeping hold of the form, and enjoying sense objects. It waxes greatly in strength. If the truth of it be sought, it will run away. We need to study this teaching carefully. There is no ego in sleep, but only in waking and dreaming. In both these states, the ego manifests by taking hold of a body, saying, I am this body. That is, there is a perception of the body, and at that same time there arises the thought, I am this body. That body is taken as the self, but it's the little self, or as the abode of the self. And the other bodies and objects that are seen at the same time are taken as not self. When again sleep comes on, both the body and the ego disappear, and with them the world also vanishes. Thus the ego is simply the ignorance that limits the real self, Atman, to a single body out of a multitude of bodies, all of which are its own creation. This world which it creates is thus divided by the ego into two parts, as self and not self, the former being a very small part, and the latter a very large one. From this arise the twin notions of I and mine, which are the substance of bondage. Bondage is the outcome of the limitation of the notion of the little self to a single body. Hence it is evident that but for the ego there can be no bondage. It thus becomes easy to accept the teaching of the sages that the real self is ever free, never became bound or subject to ignorance, and does not need to be made free. The sage, having no notion of being other than the real self, Atman, in its utter purity and perfection, is not aware of bondage. The sage is not even aware of having been bound at any time, because time itself has been transcended by him. Bondage is just a thought like any other thought, though it needs to be said that the thought of bondage has its uses, in that it leads wise people to this inquiry, which leads through the quest of the self to the realization that there is no bondage. But since bondage is inherent in the ego's sense itself, it will not cease so long as the ego itself survives. Thus we have the curious result that the ego is itself bondage, as well as the sufferer from it. It follows from this that the ego is forever debarred from the enjoyment of deliverance. How can bondage ever become free? Besides, in that state, only what is utterly real can survive, and the ego is not real, being a phantom movement. Those that nourish the hope of winning deliverance or self-realization without losing individuality are doomed to disappointment. In fact, the blessed regions which they hope to win, and which they are to retain their individuality, are as unreal as this world. What has been said about bondage applies also to ignorance, because this also is identical with the ego, and has no existence apart from the ego. We need to realize in all its implications the fact that the ego itself is the source of all the evil that besets life. But to most inquirers, the ego is dear as life itself, because they think it is themselves and do not want to lose it. They would rather suffer all the ills of life than be happy without it. Questions are framed, assuming the immortality of this non-existent soul and its survival in deliverance. These will not arise if the teaching be understood. One such question arises thus. There is the Vedantic teaching, thou art that. Formerly, this teaching was kept secret and imparted only to well-tested disciples. Thus, the serious mischiefs arising from a misunderstanding of the teaching were prevented. But nowadays, the sacred lore is accessible to all, and the consequences are far from desirable. For the higher the teaching, the greater are the evils due to its misapplication. Incompetent persons read the books and assume that the ego itself, with all its vices, is infinite, all-powerful, and above the law of right and wrong, and they cannot be set right. Even the better sort of inquirer is puzzled by the teaching, because he has not yet clearly understood the truth that there is no individuality. He takes the sacred text as meaning that the individual soul is God, or whatever else there is that is infinitely great. But he doubts the teaching because, in the sense in which he understands it, it is not only absurd, but blasphemous. And he is right in this. He is certainly far more in the right than those who accept the teaching, but in the wrong sense. The better sort of student has an instinctive sense that something is wrong. He is assailed by doubts, and he puts questions to get them cleared. Such a one asks the sage, "If I am eternal and perfect, why am I ignorant?" And the sage replied, "Who is ignorant? The real self does not complain of ignorance. It is the ego in you that so complains. It is that which also asks questions. The self does not ask any question. And this ego is neither the body nor the real self, but something arising between the two. In sleep there was no ego, and you had no sense of imperfection or ignorance then. Thus the ego is itself imperfection and ignorance. If you seek the truth of the ego, and thus find the real self, you will find that there is no ignorance. What the sage meant was that if the real self be found, the ego would be extinguished, and that the ignorance complained of will be extinguished along with the ego.